Yeah, well, first, I am really excited to be able to have the opportunity to present at SITC on behalf of my colleagues in the Thoracic Center at MD Anderson. Our project is looking, like you said, at the clinical outcomes of older adults who we defined as age 70 and up, and they have a diagnosis of metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, and they actually continued to receive immunotherapy treatment beyond radiographic disease progression because they were still deriving clinical benefit. I do think this is a really interesting project to share with the SITC community because first, it offers more information about a patient population that was largely excluded in the clinical trials that led to the initial FDA approval of immunotherapy, so those older adult patients. And then second, after we kind of burn through immunotherapy, so to speak, in the management of non-small cell lung cancer that's metastatic, our options that are left can be less effective, sometimes harder to tolerate because we're left with chemotherapy, and it has a very different side effect profile from immunotherapy, which is often well tolerated if patients don't develop a high-grade immune-related adverse event. So what we did was we actually retrospectively reviewed the clinical outcomes of the older adults, again, ages 70 and up. They had a diagnosis of metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, and they were treated with anti-PD-1 or anti-PD-L1 monotherapy between 2015 through 2019. And we used MD Anderson's Gemini lung cancer database to identify these patients, ultimately identified about 159 patients. And out of those 159 patients, there were 33 patients, so about 21% of them, who continued on the immune checkpoint inhibition therapy because they were still deriving clinical benefit. Now, these patients had to have received immune checkpoint therapy for at least 8 weeks before they had documented progression, and then they had to remain on immunotherapy treatment for at least 6 weeks afterwards because they were still deriving clinical benefit. And what we found overall is that in these 33 patients, the median duration of immunotherapy that was continued beyond that first cited documented radiographic progression was 7 months, with a median overall survival of 31.5 months. So this is quite a prolonged time period if you think about it, and continuing to derive clinical benefit for these patients. Granted, some of these patients did still receive local consolidative radiotherapy efforts to address certain sites of disease progression so that they could stay on systemic immunotherapy. That was about a quarter of patients. And then interestingly, some of these patients were also identified as pseudo-progressors, meaning, we initially were concerned that they were developing progression, but then when we actually had repeat subsets of scans, they actually had resolution or improvement. And so that was about 18% of patients. We obviously need to continue to do a better job to manage any toxicities that come up with immunotherapy. I thought one thing that was really interesting about our retrospective study here was we looked to see kind of how the older adult patients tolerated immunotherapy. There may have been some concern that maybe they weren't going to be able to tolerate it as well. Most of the patients actually did pretty well. And even the subset of patients that continued with immunotherapy beyond that radiographic disease progression, actually only about, I believe, 3 of the patients out of the 33 in our subset of patients only developed a grade 3 or higher toxicity. I think there was 1 grade 3 arthralgia, and then there was 2 cases of pneumonitis. So overall, this population can tolerate it well. I think the question now becomes can we identify biomarkers to maybe identify patients, a subset of patients that can benefit from a treatment strategy like this?